So, now that we've covered the PlayStation's North American launch lineup, let's jump back a year to December 3rd, 1994, when the PlayStation was originally released in Japan. 8 games were available for the Japanese PlayStation on launch day, including Ridge Racer, which we covered back in Episode 5. Aside from Ridge Racer, though, none of the games in Japan's PlayStation launch lineup were ever released in North America. That includes the game we're covering today, Gokujou Parodius Deluxe Pack. Parodius Deluxe Pack, as we'll call it, is a compilation that bundles Konami's 1990 shoot-'em-up Parodius and its 1994 sequel Gokujou Parodius. Both games were originally released in arcades, and while the Super Famicom got some pretty solid conversions of both, Parodius Deluxe Pack is much more faithful to its source material. If you've never seen Parodius in action before, a lot of this footage will probably look like utter nonsense, and that's kind of the point. Basically, Parodius is a parody of Konami's Gradius series of horizontally scrolling arcade shoot-'em-ups, going so far as to riff on specific level layouts and bosses. The Parodius series got its start on the MSX home computer system in Japan in 1988. The original Parodius was one of many games Konami released for the MSX alongside more well-known stuff like the Castlevania predecessor Vampire Killer and the original Metal Gear games. Konami also released downscaled versions of its arcade Gradius games for the MSX around the same time. Parodius actually started out as a side project on the MSX, serving as a way for Konami staff to blow off some steam while they were working on Hideo Kojima's Snatcher. The MSX Parodius is filled with winking references to game development, as your enemies are the physical manifestation of software bugs. These bugs have come from space to steal away the dreams and hopes of humankind, which in turn were created by an omnipotent octopus programmer named Taco. It's a little strange. The original Parodius had some great ideas at its core, and it's among the best games for the MSX, but the jerky scrolling makes it a little hard on the eyes. It's also limited in terms of scope. There's 5 playable characters, but they all share the same weapons loadout. Later games in the Parodius series would give unique weapons to each character. And some of the mechanics here are just kinda weird. The warp item I got here teleports you to the other side of the screen if you go all the way to the left or right. That's not especially useful. Probably the most well-known Parodius game, Parodius hit arcades 2 years later in 1990. This is where the series started to parody specific elements from Gradius and its sequels. One of the game's most memorable moments, a fight against a giant Las Vegas showgirl in outer space, is inspired by this boss encounter from Gradius 2. There's even a bubble level like the one from Gradius 3, only it's bubble bath themed and many of the bubbles have bunny girls trapped inside. The whole game is basically a non-stop series of references to past Konami shooters. Parodius also borrows Gradius' power-up system. The idea is that every item capsule you collect progresses you along a power-up bar at the bottom of the screen. At any time, you can press a button to cash in your item capsules and instantly equip whatever's highlighted. This gives you much more flexibility in how you upgrade your ship compared to 1980s style shooters, where you were often at the mercy of whatever power-ups enemies decided to drop. Parodius has 4 playable characters. The Vic Viper returns from Gradius with its standard lasers and missiles, while the Octopus Takosuke has a ripple laser taken from Konami's 1986 shooter Salamander. There's also a couple of guest stars from other Konami games. Twin Bee attacks with a 5-way shot and a rocket punch that travels across the length of the screen, and Pintaro here from Konami's MSX game Antarctic Adventure enlists the help of his tiny penguin buddies. There's a couple of mechanical additions that make Parodius distinct from the Gradius games. If you want to focus on the action and have the game automatically build a weapons loadout for you, you can select an auto option at the start of the game. This automatically redeems your item capsules for a predetermined set of power-ups in sequence. Parodius' power meter also has a power down option, which instantly erases all of your equipment earned through item capsules. I guess it's handy if you want to slow your ship down after collecting too many speed-ups, or if you want to start your weapons loadout from scratch, but most of the time it's just a dick move. You run the risk of hitting the power down whenever you collect one of these roulette icons, and whenever that happens, you're gonna die. Parodius borrows its secondary power-up system from Twin Bee, another Konami series. Like in the Twin Bee games, you can shoot these colored bells that show up throughout every level. After a few hits, the bells will change color, and if you collect them when they're any color other than yellow, you'll get a special limited time power-up that you can't get otherwise. I don't want to get into this too much, but I don't really like the Twin Bee games, and it's mostly because of this mechanic. In Twin Bee, your primary weapons are tied to these godforsaken bells that pop up everywhere, and you have to very carefully shoot them a specific number of times before they'll give you something useful. This often makes it really hard to focus on the enemies that you're supposed to be shooting. The thing is, this mechanic is actually a way better fit for Parodius. Spells in Parodius are infrequent enough that they're not distracting, and they only serve as supplementary power-ups, which means that you won't be too disappointed if you miss one. Parodius Da was popular in arcades and on consoles, and 1994 saw an arcade sequel, Gokujou Parodius, or Fantastic Parodius. Despite its upgraded arcade hardware and the number of years in between releases, Gokujou Parodius is visually very similar to Parodius Da. This may have been intentional, as Konami was likely banking on home console ports and didn't want to include anything too graphically intense for 16-bit hardware. Whatever the reason, there's even less of a visual upgrade here than what we saw a few episodes ago between Raiden and Raiden 2, which were released within a similar time frame. That's not to say that Gokujou Parodius isn't a worthy sequel, though. Gokujou Parodius adds 4 new playable characters for a total of 8. There's a whole bunch of new character-specific attacks, and while it has about as many levels as Parodius Da, the sheer number of playable ships gives you incentive to play through it more than once. Gokujou Parodius adds a co-op mode for 2 players, along with a new mechanic that sends your partner into angry mode if you shoot them enough. This can clear out entire screens filled with enemies if you use it at the right time, though it requires some coordination and teamwork to activate. Gokujou Parodius also lets you resume play immediately after death, instead of back at a checkpoint. This is something you'll definitely appreciate if you played through Parodius Da beforehand. Despite its looks, Parodius Da is actually kind of brutal. Dying sends you back to a checkpoint in the middle of a level, Gradius style, often putting you in the middle of huge swarms of enemies with no power-ups. Thankfully, Parodius Deluxe Pack lets you pause and enter the Konami code to get all your power-ups back in both games, and it gives you unlimited continues. The PlayStation version of Parodius Da is actually pretty solid. Aside from some extra loading time between levels, it's fairly close to arcade perfect. Gokujou Parodius is another story. It pushes the PlayStation a lot harder than Parodius Da, especially in 2-player mode. If both players are fully powered up, the action can really start to chug. The game also pauses to load before bosses and whenever you change characters. One thing you might notice is that there's a lot missing from Parodius Deluxe Pack, at least compared to other console ports. The Super Famicom version of Parodius Da added a bonus mode and an entirely new level, making it arguably superior to the arcade game. Gokujou Parodius went even further, adding 3 exclusive characters on the Super Famicom. Unfortunately, the games in Parodius Deluxe Pack are mostly straightforward arcade ports, with none of the bonus content from the Super Famicom versions. This wouldn't be the last Parodius compilation Konami would release, however. A Saturn port of Parodius Deluxe Pack launched a few months after the PlayStation version, and Konami later compiled all of the Parodius games in Parodius Portable for Sony's PSP, including an upgraded version of the MSX Parodius game that actually has smooth scrolling. If you want to play MSX Parodius, this is the version to get. Even though it had a bunch of sequels and compilations over the years, the Parodius series never made it to North America. Konami released many of its NES and Super NES shooters in the United States, including Life Force, Axelay, and Gradius 3, and yet strangely not Parodius. What's even stranger is that multiple versions of Parodius Da were released in Europe in 1992. The NES version got a Europe-exclusive localization under Konami's Palcom label, then the Super NES version launched in PAL regions, again with an English localization. Even the Game Boy port was released in Europe. I can only assume that Konami believed that the European market would more readily accept a silly shooter like Parodius than North America would. Konami's many Parodius releases in Europe throughout 1992 must have been successful because the company later localized Parodius Deluxe Pack in PAL territories for both the PlayStation and Sega Saturn. This version translates what little Japanese text was in both games and gives Gokujou Parodius the new title Fantastic Journey. Konami may have had plans at one point to publish Parodius Deluxe Pack in North America. This US published strategy guide for Sega Saturn games includes tips for Parodius and Fantastic Journey, suggesting that the writers had some indication that a US release was in the works, but it just never appeared at retail. Actually, the closest thing to a Parodius game North America ever got was released in 2011 for the Xbox 360, and that... no, let's not talk about that. It's too depressing. The Parodius series had a few more releases on the PlayStation after this one. First up was Jikyo Shabiri Parodius, a port of a Super Famicom game that was never released in arcades. The final shoot-'em-up in the series, Sexy Parodius, skipped the Super Famicom and was only released for arcades, the PlayStation, and the Sega Saturn in 1996. The last video game in the Parodius series was the PlayStation strategy RPG spin-off Paro Wars in 1997. After that, it's all like pachinko, pachinko, patchy slot, pachinko, forever and ever and ever and ever. Man, come to think of it, the pachinko level in Parodius Dog kinda gave us a glimpse at Konami's future. Back in 1994, though, Parodius had nowhere to go but up, and Parodius Deluxe Pack spurred enough interest in the series to justify 2 more sequels. All in all, it had a good run. It's just a shame that we never saw it here in the United States. Europe, you got lucky with this one. So what's next? If we're going by catalog number, that would be Tama, Adventurous Ball in Giddy Labyrinth. Yes, that's the actual title. Come on, you're intrigued, admit it. We'll see what that's all about in the next episode. See you then.